Hi, I'm Alison Stone, a Professor of Philosophy at Lancaster University in England. I'm going to introduce you to Harriet Martineau, a 19th century author and, in the words of one recent collection, a 19th century intellectual powerhouse because she wrote so much on such a variety of topics. She wrote novels, she wrote autobiographical works, she was arguably the first woman sociologist. She also wrote about economics, history, politics, and what's of particular interest to us here, many philosophical and religious topics. Now, she began a firm Christian, and many of her philosophical essays of the 1820s reflect that. Next step in her career was that she brought out the Illustrations of Political Economy in 1832, and these propelled her to fame, real fame, to the absolute centre of intellectual life in 19th century Britain. These were, in fact, some didactic stories that illustrated things like the law of supply and demand, the benefits of free trade, labour is the source of value, so illustrating various concepts from economics. And in her own words, it made her a literary lion. Everyone wanted her company, her opinions. Politicians sought her advice. And she herself took the opportunity out of this to travel around the US and write about what she got out of it. On the Crossing, she wrote a methodological essay, How to Observe Morals and Manners, which is about how to conduct anthropological and sociological fieldwork. And then she went on to bring out the book Society in America, which was her diagnosis that there's a fundamental contradiction between America's democratic principles and its actual practices of slavery and the patriarchal family. But what I want to say the most about is one of her subsequent works, Eastern Life, Present and Past, which was based on Martineau's travels around Egypt and the Near East. Now, she argues that ancient Egyptian religious philosophy is at the basis of Western culture. So we notice for her the Egyptians, not the classical Greeks. She's shifting the focus from the Greeks to the Egyptians. But she argues that there's, again, two aspects to ancient Egyptian thought, a positive side and a negative side. On the positive side, we've got belief in a law-governed universe. If you think, for instance, of the way that the ancient Egyptians used their knowledge of astronomy to construct the pyramids. So we've got belief in a law-governed universe. We've also got, as Martineau sees it, a noble morality of principles. And we've got the contrast between life and death, bringing an awareness that all life is sacred. So those are all the good side, but they're indissolubly mixed in Martineau's view with the bad side, which is theocracy. The priests monopolised knowledge of sacred matters while encouraging the common people to believe in superstitious myths and engage in superstitious rituals. Now, those myths include ones about the variety of the gods, the divine creation of the world, primeval flood, the god Osiris dying and being resurrected, the afterlife. So these positive, insightful and rational elements for Martineau are inextricably mixed together with the negative, mythic, superstitious side. And she traces the subsequent history of religions as follows, saying that the Jews tried really to extricate those positive aspects of the Egyptian culture from the negative ones, to focus on morality rather than superstition, but they didn't fully succeed. They were sort of dragged back into a focus on ritual observances and superstitions. And then Martineau says the Christians made another attempt to extricate the good from the bad. But they too were dragged back into superstitions rituals, so that we're still living basically under the sway of the ancient Egyptians. What needs to happen for Martineau is for Christianity finally to get rid of these myths and superstitions and rituals, church rituals, for example, superstitious belief in everything that's in the Bible. But, she says, if Christianity did purge itself of all of these mythic and superstitious elements, actually it would cease to exist as a religion, because we would be abandoning belief in a God who created the world, in Jesus having been resurrected, in the afterlife, in the immortal soul. What we'd be left with, having lost those core doctrines, is just the idea of a unified law-governed universe, a morality of principles, and a recognition of the value of life. So we would actually have finally realised those core positive ideas of ancient Egyptian thought and liberated them from the religious, mythic, superstitious elements with which they've all along been burdened. So that for Martineau, the history of religions moving through Egypt to Judaism to Christianity and beyond is a process where people have kept trying to free those good elements from the bad ones. And they try more and more, and they progress a bit further each time. And what's ultimately destined to happen is that we fully extricate the good from the bad, and as such, we leave religion behind altogether. So that brought Martineau to abandon her earlier religious faith and become a secularist. And she expressed that in one of her next works, Letters on the Laws of Man's Nature and Development from 1851, which is actually an exchange of letters with another author called George Atkinson. In this text, Martineau declares her commitment to naturalism, that is to say, the idea that empirical science can explain everything and provides the way in which we should approach the understanding of all phenomena. She declares her commitment as well to materialism, to there not being any non-material or supernatural forces and powers. She also declares her commitment to hard determinism, that is to say, the idea that we don't have any free will. Every action that we perform is determined by a causal chain of processes running through the universe before it. And so Martineau frankly says that we are like puppets. Everything we do is just something we're pushed to do by the causal forces around us acting upon us. And as we'd expect, she also here professes her commitment to atheism. So this was extraordinarily brave for the time, Britain in 1851, and it was very controversial. Now, Martineau's views also drew her, in the next mini phase of her thought, to embrace the positivism of Comte, and particularly his law of the 3 stages. So, according to him, societies are destined to pass through these 3 stages. First, the theological, in which events are explained by divine legislation. Second, the metaphysical, where instead we explain events in terms of abstract causes, forces and powers. And finally, the positive phase, which was being reached in Comte's view in many modern European societies, the positive phase being where events are explained scientifically and our knowledge of the laws that regulate observed phenomena is organised into a system of the sciences. And Comte provided such a system himself. Martineau produced her own condensed translation of his organisation of the system of the sciences, i.e. his text, The Course of Positive Philosophy. So Martineau translated this quite freely in her own words, and that became quite decisive for the development of positivism as a philosophical movement within 19th century Britain. So you can see how Martineau went through a progression herself whereby she became more and more of a secularist. And she also interprets the historical sequence of world religions in a way that reflects that same progression. And then in her autobiography, which she wrote in 1855, she retrospectively portrays her own philosophical development in terms of the positivist scheme of the 3 stages. As she has it, as a child, it was morbid, gloomy religiosity. Then she advanced to adolescence, where she'd got over the worst of it, but she was sort of caught in metaphysical fogs. And then she advanced as an adult to the joyful daylight of science, and she threw off the harmful influence of religion. So she, in the autobiography, very much portrays the advance from religion to science, in her own case, as coming out into the daylight, the sunlight. Now, Frances Power Cobbe, I've done a video on her for this series as well, reacted very critically to what Martineau said about this in the autobiography. Cobbe was a Christian herself and was opposed to atheism and thought that what Martineau was saying was very dangerous. And she said, atheists have been playing in a cave. They ventured into a cave a certain way. And that's okay, as long as they've not gone too far in and they can still see the sunlight of religion there on the outside. But what if we really pursue atheism as a society and we go so deep into the cave we can't get back out? So she's reversing Martineau's imagery, that whereas for Martineau religion's the cave and we emerge into the sunlight of science, for Cobbe the sunlight comes from religion, and it's as we move away from religion into atheism that we're going into a dark cave, and we need to be very careful because we might not be able to get back out. As a whole, Martineau's work is clearly philosophical, and she's taken up with many philosophical matters like whether God exists, what are the deep intellectual foundations of Western culture, what was the religious philosophy of the ancient Egyptians, do we have free will, is science the only source of knowledge? But amazingly, hardly anyone ever talks about Martineau as having been a philosopher.